Okay, so this is what we're supposed to talk about when Anita jumps on. We still have a couple minutes, so anybody have any questions about residential before we get started?
Or any deals that you're seeing and you might want to go over them to see how they look or look at the numbers?
Or just want to be impressed that I actually pulled this up and I was sharing screen. I am sharing screen, aren't I?
Oh, here she is. All right, she just showed up. I just let her
Oh,
in right
okay,
now.
good. Awesome.
Am I sharing screen? Can anybody see that?
Yes.
Okay. I was being all I can look what I did, and then I was like, I don't even know if it was. Sometimes she said she has sketchy Wi-Fi, so hopefully that's not tonight.
Let's see.
Oh, there she
Hello.
is.
Nice. I see her.
Hi, Anita.
Hi, Anita.
Hi, I did just have sketchy Wi-Fi and I was just trying to get you guys on my cell phone. I was just picking up the cord to, to make sure I had enough juice and everything after the couple of hours I've been on the phone on meetings, but it just popped up. So here I am on my computer. Let me see if I can. Okay.
So real quick, everybody, this is being brought to you by Virtual REI Academy. Sharon and I have been doing this since the Tuesday, since about I think January or February, just trying to give back. And you can go to our website and check out some freebies, and you might want to check out some of the other stuff we have there too. Tonight we have a special guest, Miss Anita, and I'm probably gonna do her injustice, but 35 years as an engineer and environmentalist. She's just very smart with all this stuff, very smart about a lot of stuff, real estate. We met her through in a different group that we belong to, and fast friends. She's very smart. We like bears and we like to hang out with bears together. And we've had a good time, as you can see that we were in Texas there, but 35 years experience in the environmental field and working with cleanup and contaminated properties. And it's so important for, both residential and multifamily. And in Baltimore, I was explaining, she's down here in Florida with us and on the East Coast, but lead paint is a big deal and some other things. So with that, I will let her take it away.
I thank you very much, Jane.
And
And it's
screen if you need your screen shared, we can unshare it so you can use yours.
you know what? Not knowing what exactly was going to happen, I do not need to share my screen. I don't have any slides or anything to show, so we'll just start.
Share your knowledge, girl.
Okay. Anyways, I want to thank you. And as Jane said, I've been in the environmental field for 35 years. I'm a chemical engineer and a civil engineer by trade. Wait a sec, there we go. Just popped up in the middle, so I have to figure out where. And I'm a registered civil engineer. I have done a lot of cleanups and investigations for corporate America. I worked for a major corporation, and these were multi-million-dollar cleanups. So I've seen a lot. We had to take streets out and replace them, demo buildings that had asphalt and asbestos. What did I say? Asphalt, asbestos and lead in them. And so I've seen a lot of different things. As Jane said, we're going to be talking about navigating due diligence. She mentioned that most of you are in the residential arena with single family homes or multi-units. So I'll make the tilt a little in that direction because it's usually looked at more for commercial, but it is very important in the residential arena also. So I'm sure you guys, so what exactly is due diligence? Just like you're doing due diligence when you buy any piece of property, you have financial due diligence, you have a lot of different things you're looking at. You have an environmental due diligence. And what you're trying to do there is identify environmental conditions that could impact the property and or cause health effects or effects on the environment. And the purpose of it really for you is to try and mitigate any liabilities associated with this transfer and with any any environmental concerns. When you have environmental impairment, there can be both legal, financial, as well as health ramifications. There can be claims from people for health risk exposures. There can be costs of cleanup, which can be considerable, and there can be delays to your projects. Nobody wants to come out and have a project, you start a renovation and all of a sudden you find out there's some contamination on the property and you have to stop, you have to get the right permits, you have to find a consultant. Nobody wants that. And then also, let's see, we were saying there's legal ramifications. You can be in violations and get a lot of penalties if things aren't done correctly. So I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, the phase 1 and phase 2. So we're going to go a little through some things. I just want to go over some of the sources of contamination and where do they come from. So just want to look a little bit here and move on. Okay.
Hey,
So,
Anita,
yes,
I don't know if everybody knows what a phase 1 and a phase 2 is.
we're going to be talking about that later. I think a lot of you are familiar with these are environmental assessments, and they have different degrees of what they do. The phase 1 just being where you're doing a paper search. You could say you look at the property, you look at records and try and assess, is it a potential that there had been contamination here? And when you get into a phase 2, that will have sampling, but I will get moving on to that at a later point. So what are some of the types of contamination there can be? There can be soil and groundwater contamination. And is everybody familiar with groundwater, what it really is? It's just where you have water in the subsurface that is filled in the spaces between rocks and between soil. It's not a big fast moving river down there. It's an area that's saturated with water. And it does move many times very slowly, and it can move onto your property and bring contaminants with it. And it can move off of your property, taking contaminants off your property. So you can have soil and groundwater contaminants, and you can also get air contamination from coming up from the soil, from compounds in the soil and groundwater. Then the second thing is you can have, let me just go through it. You have materials, you have asbestos, you have lead in building materials. You can have contaminants from that. And then third, you can have contaminants from naturally occurring sources such as radon, which are in the ground. A fourth type of contamination, a fourth kind of thing you might be wanting to look at, but I'm not really going to go much into it right now, is the potential for contaminating offsite sources and natural resources and freshwater bodies. So where does this come? What are some of the sources? We just talked about what some of the types are. So what are some of the sources of this? Well, let's talk about soil and groundwater. So how do you get contamination in the soil? Where does it come from? Well, it's usually from either current usage or past uses. Now, if it's residential, doesn't have as much, there aren't as many sources as the historical, commercial and industrial uses. Some of the use, so if you had a commercial property, chemicals were used in many different things in the daily usage. And you could have it coming from spills or washing down at night. And you can often see things like, well, some of the most common ones are motor oil, hydraulic oil, fuels, all of these types of things. You have chemicals, you have solvents, different types of things that are used throughout the daily activities. So then you also have from storage from underground and above ground tanks. And these typically could have fuel oils, or they could have other types of chemicals in them, such as what you would call volatile organic compounds. And these are compounds that easily move through the soil. They evaporate easily. And some of these types of things you find associated with, for example, dry cleaners. You probably have heard of things that they're called PCE, TCE. So those are often associated with a dry cleaner. They stored them many times in below ground tanks, which leaked and they went into the subsurface, and being volatile, they moved on to other people's property. So we have the oils, those type of materials. We have the volatile materials, and then we have often heavy metals. And heavy metals, some of the most common ones are lead and arsenic, and they have enough number of sources. As you are all familiar with, you have lead containing paint. And this is a thing I'm going to be talking a little bit more about when I talk about materials in the house or in a structure. But here you can actually get them into the soil by the chipping paint that falls down into the ground. There's also many other sources, battery manufacturers. I've had a site I cleaned up where there'd been a battery manufacturer before, and it was a horrendous level of lead in the soil. And it was so high that during disposal, we could hardly find a facility. We had to send someplace where they basically entombed it, because it was considered not just hazardous, but ultra hazardous, if you want to call it that. And so these are some of the types of compounds you will find. And as we said, where do they come from? From the daily usage, from storage, underground pipes that leaked. Now, in houses and residences, you may say, okay, you don't have the same amount of stuff, but you definitely have things there. Jane was mentioning about a fuel tank. There are people, especially in areas where they have, the old types of stoves that need the fuel. Sometimes they have their own underground tanks. And also during some of the times where it was difficult to get fuels, people put in diesel tanks, especially on larger properties. So you do have that there. And you also have asbestos containing materials in houses and residences, as well as in the commercial. Asbestos has been used around for many years, and some of the main uses of it you'll find it for insulation material, the duct material. You'll find it in tiles. You'll find it in other kind of flooring, the backing on flooring. You'll find it in joint material and spackling. As far as presence of asbestos, though, spackle and joint material was banned back in the 70s, so I think it was 77. And throughout the 80s, other material was banned, so that up till 89, when the EPA did a complete ban on using these types of asbestos materials. And lead is probably another thing you are familiar with. You can find that many places also, but in houses, it's mainly found in lead-based paint. And that ended in 1978. So we'll get back to that later, that when you're looking at houses and residences, you're looking for buildings that for lead are older than 1978, and for asbestos before 89. And sometimes people say, to be safe, just say anything before 2000, but it can still be there today, even though it hasn't been used for a long time. So those are kind of just the sources and some of the types of things you'll come across. Again, there are a lot more chemicals out there, but these are some of the main things. Before I kind of go on a little to the actual, how do you then not get a property that has these things in them, and talk about the due diligence. Are there any questions right now? Okay, so let me just make sure I have my notes here. Oh, and of course, I forgot to say something. I forgot to talk about radon. And radon is a naturally occurring material. It is the breakdown that comes from uranium. And it is generally found in the soil and rock in the subsurface. That's where it's a problem. And it's a breakdown of uranium, and it's a gas, and it can come up through the soil and make its way into your house through cracks in the foundation and other places it can come in and get trapped in the house. And that's an issue because this is a compound that is radioactive, and if you have a long-term exposure to it, there is an increased risk for lung cancer. So that was another one of the types of contamination. So now we don't want to get stuck with any of these types of properties. So what is it you do? You do a due diligence. And what is the due diligence? And this is where we were talking about a phase 1 and phase 2 environmental study. There are other types of environmental studies that you might want to do and these are not required by law for you to do. There are certain things, there's certain requirements from lenders and maybe some localities, but it's not a general that you have to do these. But this is something to protect yourself. And let's go over what these things are. A phase 1 is an assessment to see what is the likelihood of there being contaminated material or hazardous material on your property or on adjacent properties that could affect your property. And this could be affecting the property value. It could be potential hazard health risks, especially if you have tenants there. So this is something you want to look at. And how is a phase 1 done? This is the types of things that are done during a phase 1 are looking at the history of the site. What were the usages of it? And typically people go 100 years back. Some people go 50 years back, and that can cause a big problem. You want to interview potential you want to interview former owners and people who know about this property. You do need to do a record review. You need to look at files and say, what hazardous materials are there in the neighborhood? What hazardous leaks are known in the neighborhood? Are there any documents of leakage on your particular property? And during this kind of a phase 1, you often do research by looking at aerial photos and something else. I'll get back to something called the Sanborn fire insurance maps. And Sanborn fire insurance maps were maps that were put together for evaluation of the hazards of fire on properties. These started in the 1800s, I think it was 1867, and went through, I think the last ones were about 1990. And these are very interesting because they are they have a coverage through a lot of the United States. Each town will have a map, and it will have an index in the front, and then it will have in different areas, it will show you what is in that area. And because it was for fire insurance, they show what kind of a dwelling it was, what kind of a business it was. They will show the material that the dwelling was made of, if it was wood, or all of these types of things. They also may show you the location of underground tanks, pits, all of these different things. So it's a really good source for finding out what was the property used for before. Also, has there been anything right next to it? That's always an issue too. So these are the sources that people use when they do the phase one. Now, the phase one, and I want to get this one exactly right. The phase one is described by the EPA, and actually, let me see, there are standards. I want to get this one exactly right. The ASTM has a standard for doing a phase one, and that's called the ASTM E1527-21. Some of you may know it as the ASTM E1527-13, but it actually was updated this year as of February, and that's the new one, where they went in and clarified some of the different types of language, what is likely, different small things in there. So these tell you exactly what need to be done. In the phase one, you are supposed to identify what's called REC, recognized environmental conditions. And it has this fancy definition of it, but really it's sources of it. And some of the most common sources, see if I can find the list of it, but the most of this, yes, here it is. Some of those are underground storage tanks, leaking underground storage tanks, dry cleaners, junkyards, automobile salvage, metal plating facility, industrial and chemical site locations, suspect fill materials found on site, used chemical or fuel drum areas, and groundwater or soil vapor impacts at adjacent locations. Those are some of the things that are so well known to have contaminated material that they say, let's identify if any of those are present at the site. Other types of things, as we were talking also about, how does soil get into the subsurface? A couple of other things that we should mention are that people through time have typically dumped material and buried material, and in ways that we aren't doing it nowadays. It was just standard practice. So many times you'll have to find that and look, are there places that look like they have been disturbed? Do they have, when you come out to a site, you look, you say, are there any areas? They do a site inspection. Are there any areas where the vegetation is off? Are there any things that look like fill, and there is strange topography? Those are all of the types of things that an environmental professional would go and look at when he comes out at a site to do a phase one. I also want to mention one of the ways that contamination comes on your property, and it's not that uncommon, is that when people do construction projects, they have a need for fill soil. And fill soil can be very expensive. When we did our projects, it was commercial, we had big liabilities. So we had big liabilities. So we wanted to make sure that the fill soil we had was always tested before it came to our site to make sure it was free from chemicals, but typically we would buy material from a quarry. This can get to be very expensive. And a lot of people will go for the material that they see at some site. They go drive by that says free soil. Now, there's a reason that soil might be free. It could easily come from a contaminated property. So that's one of the things you have to be careful about also. So we're talking about the phase one. Phase one also has a requirement that it has to be done by an environmental professional. So what is an environmental professional? An environmental professional is a certified geologist or a registered engineer, or it can also be a combination of a degree and experience. And it doesn't mean the person out there, doing all the steps has to be certified. He just has to be working under an environmental professional. Excuse me, just has to be working under environmental professional. So that's the first step where you go and look and say, are there any likely contamination on this property? And if you see, yes, we had a lot of different usage that probably, I worked a lot with manufactured gas plants. Those were when they had, prior to the distribution of natural gas, gas companies would heat oil, or they would use coal, and they would get the gas refined off of it, and they would use that for heating and lighting. And after that process, there could be coal tar, there could be what was called lamp black, there could be wood chips that were covered with cyanide that was taken out of the gas. And many times this was just buried. Totally different time than we have now. I've come across underground tanks for oil that were built of brick. So you can imagine how well that held the oil, when it was abandoned and just covered over. A lot of these things were not removed when they left that property. So if you see evidence of contamination, you go on to a phase two. And phase two has an ASTM standard that is ASTM E1903-11. And this gives the framework for completing the second phase, which includes testing. Now, how much testing, what testing needs to be done, all depends again on what you see visually, what you found out has been there at the site. It could be an isolated little area, a little pocket where you take some samples, or it could be taking samples that go down to the soil and taking samples of the groundwater. Sometimes you may need to go 40 feet, 80 feet, 100 feet to go down to the groundwater. Now, this is usually if you expect that it could have gone down, it could have moved through the soil. And sometimes there are other additional samples that are taken, and that is of indoor air. If you think you had some of those volatile compounds in the subsurface, and they may have come down under, they would be in the subsurface and evaporated up or volatilized up and get caught under a building, just like we were talking with radon gas, it can come in under the building. Again, if we go back to the dry cleaner example, they have that PCE, it's the solvent, the chlorinated solvent. Many times when it gets into the ground, maybe from an underground tank, it goes down in the ground, finds a layer of soil that's a little tighter, and then it moves along that, and then it finds a little crack again, and then goes down to the groundwater. Then the groundwater is moving along, and it finds some soil that is more porous, and then it evaporates up through that soil, and then it can get in under buildings. It might just go out to the air, or it could get caught in under a building. So depending on what you have, you might be doing some vapor studies. You may be doing some sampling of the groundwater. You may be doing some soil samples. Now, phase one does not include the assessment of lead and lead chips. That is typically not what's in there. On a phase one, they may identify that they see chips, chipping paint and such, but remember, phase one has no sampling, so they don't sample for that. They don't sample for asbestos. Again, somebody may look at it and say, yes, it looks like there could be asbestos containing compounds there. Materials. Now, this is a phase one as it's covered in the scope by ASTM. You can request to have an environmental consultant add those things on, and many times people do that. Again, phase two is where you add in the sampling. So one of the things we need to look at also with the phase one and phase two for it to make more sense is why do you need to do the actual phase one? Well, now we need to look at something called CERCLA. Have to go back and kind of circle back to that. And I always forget the exact name of it. It is the, I believe, Comprehensive Environmental Response Recovery Act, Liabilities Act. And let me get this because I want to, okay. Yes, it is the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, or the Superfund Act, and that came in the early 80s. And so why do we care about this? Well, that one outlines cleanup of remediation of contaminated sites. And it is nice enough to say that an owner or property owner can be held liable for the property cleanup based solely on their current ownership of the property. And a property owner may be held liable for contamination even if they did not deposit the hazardous substances on the site or knowingly or negligently allow unsafe conditions to persist. So basically, you can get a whammy even if you're not the one responsible for it. I know that seems a little unfair, and through time, they've made amendments to this act, and they have come up with some landowner liability protections. And they have three different kinds. One is called a bona fide prospective purchaser protection. That is mainly if you are buying a piece of property that you know is impaired, and there has certain restrictions. There may be certain land use covenants on it, some restrictions for land use on those. And they may also have requirements that you can't dig certain places and you have to have certain equipment going. So that's the first one. The second was contiguous property owner. And that is for people who are adjacent to a property that has contaminated theirs. And then the one we mostly deal with is the innocent landowner protection. And that is for contamination on your property. If you were to discover some contamination or a release on your property, you could use the innocent landowner defense if you have done due diligence, if you have followed the phase one, and if warranted, the phase two. There are also a few other conditions that might be there. For example, if you discover a release on your property, you have an obligation to disclose that. And sometimes just can be hard to figure out what agency. So often going to the fire department, talking to them, or the local health department or the state environmental department are good places to start. But you have a disclosure responsibility there. and a responsibility to not let it get worse. You know, you can't just say, oh man, it looks like there's some, some oil going into the subsurface. Yeah, I'll get around to that at some point. You know, you're not supposed to let it get worse. So that's why it's important to be doing the phase 1 and the phase 2 in accordance with the ASTMs. Now, you could, if you think that there's not a lot of possibility for contamination and you just want to do a simple environmental survey for yourself without that, you could, but it's not going to give you the protection that you would from doing a phase 1 and phase 2. So moving on, we said the phase 1 and phase 2 doesn't include things like the lead and the asbestos. And as many of you know, lead paint is a big issue. So as you know also, if you're selling the property, you don't have to go in and find out if there is lead paint. If you know there is, of course, you have to disclose. There's a lot of rules and regulations around lead and asbestos. And there's disclosure rules. They have to give you time to do an assessment for it if you want. And one of the things to note is that if you get a normal house inspection, that is not something that is included. I mean, he may again say, hey, you have some peeling paint, but that is not something that is included in a normal house inspection. And so back to, there's disclosures on that, and you may want to get a lead assessment done. That is, for the property. There are, again, regulations on that. EPA has a lot of different regulations, and they have a lot of good material. They have the pamphlets you have to use for disclosure if you have tenants and before any renovation work has to be done. And one of the good sources is the leads as let me just get some of these here. You have to have the lead safe certified guide to renovate, it's the to renovate right. And let me get the telephone number here. The National Lead Information Center is by EPA is where you can get a lot of the different documents you need. And that's 1-800-424-LEAD, or that's 5323. So that's 1-800-424-LEAD. And there you can get the document you need for disclosure. That is correct. You can get the document you need for disclosure. You can get the information on how to test for lead. Let's see, you can get, they have regulations on the removal of lead. If you have flaking paint and all of these types of things, it needs to be remediated. It needs to be renovated. And if you're doing any renovations, you need to deal with that. You also, and let me get my thought again. So there's disclosure, there is renovation, there is testing. All of those things have rules for them. And there's a lead safe document that goes through all of these types of things, again, available at that same source. And as far as asbestos, again, not part of the phase 1. And you may decide, do I need to do this? And backing up to the lead, again, houses before 1978, that's where we're really talking about needing to do this. There can, of course, be lead paint still. It's from, I'm sorry. This is for houses from before 1978. And for asbestos, they say 1989 or through 2000. And again, that can still be in the house. Other things that you can have is, that I didn't talk about earlier, that they may look for is mercury from lamp ballasts. Those are also things that you have to be concerned about and make sure get taken out and disposed of correctly. And again, similar to lead with the asbestos, you again have EPA rules on how to test for it. It has to be certified person to test for it. Once you find it, it has to be, there's a lot of types of containment you need because asbestos gets airborne. There's two types of asbestos, one that's called friable and one that's called non-friable. Friable are, for example, in your duct material, in some of the let's see, insulation material, and the fibers can actually break loose there. They can also be in the paper backing of vinyl asbestos vinyl flooring. It can be in some of the roof tiles. So those things are breakable and you can get the fibers into the air. The non-friable are, for example, what you find in the 9x9 tiles that, they look like a ceramic tile, but they have the asbestos in them. And there it first becomes friable if you start drilling in them and chipping them and letting the dust come out. So there's a lot of rules on abatement and containment that the EPA has on that. In addition, you'll find there's also federal rules from OSHA on how you need to abate and what you can have in the air, testing to make sure you have cleaned everything up. And additionally, there's also specific rules for disposal. Kind of going back a little to the lead, there are exceptions that people can do some of it themselves. There's exceptions for how big an area you disturb, and there are exceptions for that don't have to follow those rules for removing it, but you still need to dispose of it properly as a hazardous waste. So those are some of the things you need to do for the due diligence. I saw somebody ask, it's in the ballasts of lamps that you have mercury sometimes. So that's the thing that also needs to be looked at to make sure you have those are disposed of properly. But again, that's usually not a thing you would say would be a no-go for buying a property. Those are just some things that you would look at and say, how do I need to dispose of that? So now you're looking at this and saying, do I need to do the phase 1, phase 2 on single property I go out and look at? One of the things I would suggest for people that are, especially investors, that are doing a lot of properties in the same area. That's very common. You work in one area and you buy a lot of properties in that area. I would suggest go out and learn some of the same things and do some of the same things that are being done in the phase 1. Talk to the because many of these things will apply to all of your properties. Go out, go to the building department, talk to somebody about the building and planning. How was the city? How is it growing up? What were some of the uses? Go look at historical aerial photos. Aerial photos can be found at many libraries and many universities. There's collections. You can go through and get aerial photos through the times so you know how the city was built up. You can go to the historical societies, talk to people there, find out how did it develop? Go to the agencies. They actually have maps that show you where documented spills have been. You can look at the topography and say, where are there likely to, how would the things move on the surface? What would likely come in a certain direction? So knowing something about the history and what has been used in the area of violations, all of those things are very valuable when you just start going out to look at a property. And then some of the tricks of the trade, like I said, for people when they go out, they look at, are there areas that look like something could, the topography is a little different. There could be something buried there. What does the vegetation look like? Is there one area that's a big beige spot or something? And you see that that's right next to the garage, where potentially things could have run out of the garage. So some of those things are well to look at yourself, and you can do that as the very first screening. So when you do go to do a phase 1 and phase 2, you need to get a environmental consultant that is very well versed in this. There's different prices on this, but some do it very cheaply. And one of the reasons is they have all the databases set up, they have all the maps set up. And so it's, they can do part of that very quickly. What I would say when looking for a company is make sure you go in and get somebody that is an environmental professional. Knowing just a little can make you dangerous, and you can ask them, are you doing these per ASTM standards? Is this under the supervision of an environmental professional? You can ask them a little about, how they are doing it. Another thing I would suggest, sometimes you have a company that you're really happy with, and then you use them for a phase 1, phase 2 in a totally different area. They may be a national company, they may have people everywhere, but many times the little local company that does the same area over and over is very familiar. They have good connections to the people at the city planning. They have the local authorities, as I said, the sources like the Historical Society. I did a lot of work in the LA area, and I had to do an assessment down in a city called El Centro, a smaller city just by the border to Mexico. About 3 hours drive, 3 to 4 hours drive from LA. We had a lot of companies we worked with, but I chose to have a small company, very familiar with the area, do the assessment instead. And that's kind of what I had to say about this. And if there's some questions, I'd be more happy to answer them.
Thank you so much. That was a wealth. And I know we talked about it, right brain house hunter. I just run out and look for houses, but you know what I mean? So we talked about the other day a little bit on the phone. We kind of stumbled into a house in Harford County that I don't know why we said no to that particular house, but it had a gas station next to it. And, we didn't know to call you at that time, but
We didn't know her.
right. So, that could have turned into one of those big failures where it was contaminated and we didn't know it.
Yeah. But that's what I'm saying is, especially if you're working in the same area, do a little research you can use for all of the different ones. I was talking as one of my favorite things is that Sanborn company, there's Sanborn fire insurance maps. But if you're looking at them, make sure you find the key, the page that talks about what all the different symbols are. It won't be in the corner typically as a legend. It might have something, but there's going to be a key and it's going to just be able to tell you amazing things. It also might tell you about how is the building originally, how is it built out, and you can go find it where the permits pulled, it can give you a lot of information that way too, in addition to the history to be used with the environmental assessment.
Right, and I put the link in the comments for that particular thing again. Until the other day, I hadn't ever heard of that, so that was good. Anybody have any questions? I know lead paint's a big thing in the city about asbestos. Jean, my radio voice, always has a question. Maybe.
One thing I also wanted to say
You
is
did
we
good.
talked up front about that, there's contaminated soil, there's, the building materials, there's radon. Those types of things, again, will be more or less important depending on the specific property. If you are looking at, as you said, the city of Baltimore in the inner city, you're going to really want to go back and look at the history, look at contaminated properties. Again, and places where there's shallow groundwater, there can be a lot more problem than places where there are deep groundwater. So those are some of the things that affect it. If you're in an agricultural area, there may be pesticide usage, and so you kind of look for that. And again, buildings before 1978, as everyone knows, are late 80s or 2000 for the asbestos and lead. So, and radon, that is more prevalent in the Northeast than, for example, down in Florida, but it does exist down in Florida. And what's interesting is, in addition to the federal laws, there are state and local laws. The EPA does have a map that's called the Map of Radon Zones. That will show you which areas in the United States, based on the geological formations, typically have the most radon. Doesn't mean that if you're in an area of low that you won't have anything, but those are the areas that typically have the most.
I thought you had to be concerned about radon. I'm from Northeast. I thought you had to be concerned with radon if it had a basement. Is that not the case?
You know what? That's where where you're going to find the highest contamination. Absolutely. So it's basically, if you have a basement or, on ground slab, if you have a crawl space, it's not going to be as much of an issue at all, because the radon is in the subsurface and it moves up through the soil, and where does it get caught in the house? You're looking at, does it have elevated levels there? A basement, of course, is much farther down, obviously, and they can come through cracks in the wall, and this could be a sidewall crack or a crack in the floor. But again, it's very dependent on the area.
So only if you have a basement should you do a radon test then, or not worried about if it's on slab or crawl?
Well, on slab, it can also have the one that I would say most was with the basement. The next would be if it's on slab, and least if it's, it has a crawl space under it. But that's just one of the elements of it. It depends on what is typical in your area. You can also see from other assessments, what have people been finding. There are certain rules, for example, in Florida, that if you are going to have a childcare facility, you have to do a radon assessment. So it's not really a big thing on most people's radar, just regionally.
Good to know.
Yeah. Thank you, Anita. I did have a question.
Yeah.
So just recently had a conversation with an investor in the Baltimore County / city as well. But apparently he's been getting a lot of fees increase, not in taxes, but oddly enough on the sewage. Is that a concern with the city or the county that we need to be aware of?
I really wouldn't be able to tell you.
Okay. Just
Yeah.
curious. Just wonder hazard. we were talking about hazards. I was like, okay, let me ask that question.
One thing more I did want to talk about was, again, many times I've seen investors, they look at the environmental assessment and say, okay, that's just a box I have to check off. But, you know, there can be real ramifications of it. And a couple of interesting things is I have seen residential properties, again, people say, well, that's more commercial. I've seen residential properties. There's a big known one in California down in the Del Amo area where it was built over impoundments that where waste was put from some of the refineries. And now, many years later, they're, you know, plants are dying, they're smelling things, and they found out that there is, you know, vaporization, things are coming off the material that was down in the impoundments. Now, because it's a whole tract housing and it's a large company like that, they were able to identify it. You know, there is, you know, there's some, you know, you can say there is some support in the that there's so many of them. You know, it turns into a class action suit. It turns into something where, you know, you actually have somebody that is responsible. Sometimes there are sites where they figure out what it was, but that company has gone out of business, and the homeowners can be out of luck if there isn't any funding from the state or the federal government from orphan sites funds. And the other thing is, I came across some townhouses, and they were built on top of an old manufactured gas plant. And what's interesting here is that city of Anaheim had hired an environmental consultant to do the phase 1, phase 2. They had gone and looked at it and said, oh, this is an area of Anaheim, there's only orchards, no problem, you know. Then once they started working on it, they came across some material and they couldn't understand what that was. And they did end up removing it. It didn't go to the groundwater. But what had happened is, this was from a manufactured gas plant that had existed from sometime in the early 1900s to about 1920, when high power gas lines came through. And so that was long gone before the orange orchards came. They went back about 50 years. Then they said, oh, 1940s, 1950s, orchards, no problem. So there are issues with residential also.
Yeah,
Interesting.
Anita, go ahead.
Go
Before
ahead.
I
I
ask
was just,
my question.
yeah, go ahead, Fernand.
Oh, okay. Right. So my question is around illegal dumping of materials that contain like toxic substances and sharp objects all over, you know, the environment. And I believe it might have, you know, less impact on the environment as opposed to more of a health and safety risk. You know, can you talk on that, you know, as far as the environment is concerned and the impact?
Yeah, okay. It all depends on what kind of illegal dumping it is. You know, is it heavy lead? Is it some, you know, is it oil that's from cars or something like that? Sometimes you have some petroleum hydrocarbons that are not very immobile, and they will, you know, they're heavier ended. If your soil is tight, it won't move too far. Then you have other types of materials that are much more volatile, and those can go down to the groundwater, as we were talking about, and just take off there, and they can end up coming out to a fresh water body and causing problems for the fish, for the plants. again, some of the illegal dumping, some of the problems there, people take soil and from one place and then bring it over to their property. So those are some of the ways it spreads. Again, it's the more volatile type of compounds that tend to move, spread out faster in the environment. And
Okay.
again, volatile just means it evaporates easier.
All right. Thank you.
Any other questions? Hey, Nita, we still have a couple seconds left. You want to talk about the green roof specialist for a minute, since you're managing partner there?
Thank you. Yeah, having come from this environmental background, I really love green plants and what they can do for the environment. And so I have my own little company where we do vegetated roofs and vegetated walls. And for example, if you put plants on a roof, it can help bring down your electrical costs because the air that comes in is cooler. It can help in runoff because it retains about 40 to 80% of the water that comes down on it in the first few hours, and ultimately retains maybe 40%. It can help bring down the urban heat index. And this is also for vegetation on walls. It can help absorb the contaminants in the air. And sometimes you'll find canyons in cities, they call them, where you have very, very high buildings, and the air quality in that area is much worse than in the general area. And having plants, whether they're on the walls of buildings or in the center of the street, will help the air quality there. And it will also bring down the heat in areas that are highly asphalted and have high buildings and such. So this is one of the things I love to do. I also do these for indoor, the green walls, and this helps the air quality indoor. And another thing, just for the fun of it, I do it for events.
Cool. That's awesome. If anybody wanted to get a hold of you, can you do inspections now, or you can answer questions for that, or do you do some coaching, mentoring for that, or if they wanted to get a hold of you for that or the green roof stuff?
If somebody wants to get hold of me, let me see if I can just put my email in the chat here. And they can get hold of me for. Okay, just a second. Okay, make sure I spell it right. And I think I spelled it wrong. Yeah.
I always do put the wrong thing in there.
Okay, green rose. Okay. Okay. And at this point, I do some consulting, but I can also help people get over to the correct people and kind of guide them how they should move forward. And like I said, anybody interested in green roofs, green walls, and other green infrastructure, I can help with that.
Awesome. Good stuff.
Perfect.
Really appreciate you being here and taking time out of your very, very, very busy day to come hang out with us and give some good information on stuff we all should be looking forward to, and that could be some problems in the legal field too. So
Right.
appreciate it.
Again, I'm not giving legal advice whether you should or you shouldn't do the phase 1, phase 2. I'm telling you something about the liabilities associated with it and protection of doing that. So
Right, and it's good to know. It's actually funny you said that to me the other day, and then we were on another meeting, and the guy was like, "Hey, I just ordered a phase one," so then I actually knew what it meant.
Right.
So thanks for that.
Well, thanks
All
for
right.
having me. I appreciate you having me. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you. And thank
Absolutely.
you, everybody, for attending.
Thank you.
All right, guys, we'll see you next week. Same channel.
Good night, everybody.
Night.
All right, good night.